Mixing the first 3 steps that I go through every single time: kick, bass, and then the sidechain. And by sidechain here, I just mean getting the kick and bass relationship right. All right, so why are these 3 the starting point? First reason, the kick and bass are the most important elements in the track. If you think about it, when you take the kick and bass away in the break, what happens? People stop dancing. When you bring them back in the drop, what happens? People start dancing. So it's literally automatic. And so if your kick and bass aren't right, then your track is not going to translate in the club. People aren't going to dance. DJs aren't going to play your music. So the stakes are definitely high, and I want to get these right from the beginning. Now, the second reason is more technical. The kick and bass take up the most headroom in the mix. They're the arrangement elements with the most energy. And so it makes sense, at least to me, to mix everything in relation to the kick and the bass. The kick and the bass, when they're playing and then maybe other things are on top of them, that's the moment when you might get level spikes that might over-engage the master limiter. And so there's a little bit of technical tweaking that you'll have to do. And so I want to get the kick and the bass technically right, because everything else is a creative decision. Where you place the clap, where you place the open hat, the synths, the vocals. Those are all kind of creative decisions and matters of taste. So I might do one thing and you might do something else, and both can sound awesome. But when it comes to the kick and bass, we want to get those technically right. And that's what I mean here. The creative sits on top of the technical. If we can get the technical things right, it'll give us a solid foundation for being creative and experimental on top, and being confident that our moves are going to work. Now, bottom line though, our goal is to get a low end that translates in the club. That's what it's all about, getting that low end groove, and that's what these 3 steps are about. So step number 1 here is set the kick peak around -6 dB in the spectrum analyzer. Now I have peak with an asterisk here because I don't mean kick fundamental. The kick fundamental is whatever the pitch of the kick is. So if you have a kick that's a pitch of G, then the fundamental frequency there is going to be 49 hertz, but that doesn't mean that 49 hertz there is going to be the loudest frequency in the kick, so, or the loudest part of the kick. So by kick peak, I mean the loudest part right there. And then park it around -6 dB in the spectrum analyzer. That's a double asterisk because the sweet spot after analyzing hundreds of tracks is between -4 to -6 really on average for a tech house track. And so I park it at -6 because it's a little bit more conservative but still safe, meaning that it'll still translate. Later on in the mix bus stage or the mastering stage, I might push the track, which will make the kick and bass a little bit louder, but I like to just park it at -6 because it's a great place to start. And so here's some examples of that. So Theme from Sexpress. God, I cannot pronounce that, okay? The Detlef remix. His kick is parked right there at -6. Latman Footsteps, kick right there at -6. Jamie Jones, Kooky Chords, bam, right there at -6. All right, now here's some wonky examples just because I want to show you there's some variation, but I want to let you know that -6 is a starting point. It's a safe starting point. It's where I'm always starting. So Rub Another Dub featuring Green Velvet. That kick is at -2, okay? Crazy, very rare. You can pull it off, of course, but pretty intense, okay? And then here we have Max Chapman and George Smettles. Their track Zulu, their kick is a little bit softer, -8. Now, they do have some crazy stuff going on with the bass down here, so it makes sense in this track, but that's the whole point. I want to show you that there's details and contingencies to kind of consider here, but I'm going to keep this video straightforward for now, just the first 3 steps, because every single time I park the kick at -6 and then I work from there. It's a fail-safe starting point, and yeah, so step number 2. Set the subharmonics of the bass between -6 to -12 in the spectrum analyzer. Now I have sub in quotes here because I'm using a loose definition. I'm using my definition of subharmonics, which is just any of the bass harmonics below 100 hertz. So if we look in the picture here, we can see that these 2 harmonics are below 100 hertz. This is just a saw wave, and maybe did a little bit of an EQ boost here to boost the second harmonic, but they're just parked right around -8, okay? And so where within the window of -6 to -12 you want to park these, that's just, again, a matter of taste. As long as you're in that window, it's very likely that your low end in the bass is going to translate in the club. And so a couple examples again here. Latman Footsteps, that bass harmonic right there, I think it's an F87, doesn't really matter, but it's below 100 hertz. It's parked at -8, so perfect right there. Egyptian Lover, Latman remix. So we have 2 harmonics now below 100 hertz. That guy's around -8. The other one's around -11. Exactly right. Latman's getting some love in this video. So we got the kick level, we got the bass level. Now it's all about getting the low end groove. That's what it's all about. And so this is my 3-part sidechain trick for ultimate precision. And I'm not being dramatic here. We can be as precise as we want, okay? But it's all about getting that low end groove. So let's dive right in. The first step is making room for the kick transient. I use the LFO tool, and don't worry if you don't have the LFO tool, although I do highly recommend it. This is like the one plugin I recommend getting. But if you don't have it, I will show you in the demonstration a way around this. But make room for the kick transient because I want a consistent punch on the kick every single time. The kick is the pulse of the track, and I want to make sure that that gets expressed. So I just carve out a little bit of space from the bass to make room for that kick transient. Number two is define the low end groove. This is where we start getting the pump of the bass, and we literally draw in how we want the pump to be with the LFO tool. Now, there is a little bit of technical consideration. Drawing in the pump is kind of creative because it's just more of a vibe and feel kind of thing. But there is a technical consideration because the tail of the kick and the bass might add up together to over-engage the master limiter. And so that if that happens, we might need to bring this guy down a little bit and carve a little bit more out of the bass, so creating a stronger pump effect. There are other ways around that, but we'll check some things out in the demonstration. Step number two, though, is just starting to define that low-end groove, the movement and interaction between the kick and the bass. Step number three is creating an organic interaction between the kick and the bass, and I like to do that with a sidechain compressor. So we actually imprint the kick dynamics onto the actual bass so they're interacting in a real way. Now, the LFO tool, these guys can sound a little bit clinical because they're completely unrelated to the sounds that they're modifying. They're literally just cycling volume envelopes. But when we add in the sidechain compressor and we actually imprint the kick dynamics onto the bass, then they're actually responding to each other, and it makes a world of difference. All right, so before we dive into the demonstration, just bottom line, if your kick and bass are at the right level, if there's an organic interaction and bounce between your kick and bass, then your low end's going to translate. End of story. All right, so let's dive in. All right, so with this demonstration, the way I think it's going to go is I made a couple of these little loops here, demonstration loops, and we're going to dive in and look at the first three steps, but I mix these, okay? I know this video is the first three steps of mixing, but I went ahead and mixed these little loops that I created because I want you to actually experience how important that sidechain and pump is to the groove of the track, and if I didn't mix these, you wouldn't quite appreciate it in the same way. So I want to kind of A-B that here. We'll also look at the first three steps, and then after we look at these two loops, we'll go ahead and dive in and maybe make a couple loops just walking through those first three steps. So let's go ahead and just play the first one here. All right, cool. And so the first step is looking at the kick. So let's go ahead and check out what the kick's doing. Kick is sitting right there at -6. So step one, check. And what about the bass? Cool. And so here we have 3 harmonics below 100 hertz. I called those the subharmonics, just loosely. But these 3 harmonics, this first one is sitting around -9. Then we have one around -9.5. And then here we have one around -11. So we're in the range of -6 to -12 below 100 hertz. So we're good to go there. Step 2, done. And then step 3 is what it's all about. It's creating that low-end groove. So let's check out the chain. So here's the chain right here. We have the transient sidechain, we have the pump sidechain, and then we have the sidechain compressor exactly like we talked about. Don't worry, we're going to walk through this, but I just want to go ahead and A-B this for you just to see the difference. So let's start with it on, then I'll take it off, and we'll turn it back on again. All right, here we go. So I made this little goofy slide to kind of describe what I'm hearing, but of course the question is, what are you hearing? Now, when I have the sidechain on, to me it sounds like there's this instant groove, this instant bounce. It sounds more assertive. And then I have this whole slew of synonyms here, right? there's this glue because everything is acting together. It sounds cohesive and unified. And importantly, it sounds intentional and deliberate, like it's supposed to be like that. Intentionality, I think, is a really key aspect of having a professional sound. But that's for another time. But most importantly, also, it inspires a physical reaction. When the sidechain comes on, all of a sudden I start moving because my body wants to move in sync with the dynamics of the track. And then when the sidechain is off, the opposite happens because we have this disconnected and this disjointed feel, so you don't quite know what you should be responding to. The bass sounds flat because it doesn't have the same dynamics as the groove, and because they're acting independently. And so to me, it sounds awkward, it sounds amateur, and I'm just kind of left confused. So let's check it out again and let me know if you're hearing what I'm hearing. Again, we'll do the same thing: on, off, then back on. So here we go. All right, so that is the first demonstration loop, and then next what we'll do is we'll go to the second one here. So let's play this, and then we'll check out the first 3 steps as well. All right, cool. So with the kick, let's see what the kick is doing. So kick, again, right there, parked at -6, and then with the bass, let's check out the bass. Awesome. The bass is sitting right there at -6. And now this is interesting because that's pretty high, right? That's at the upper end of the little range I was talking about. But because if I play the kick and the bass together, you're going to see that they're actually about an octave apart. So the kick is about an octave below the bass. And so we could really push the bass because it's not going to be causing that many problems with the kick. It's not going to be causing a lot of phase issues. All right. So I just figured I'd really push that there, and I think it sounds pretty cool. And then, of course, step 3 with the sidechain. The first step was getting the kick at -6, then the bass between -6 to -12, and then here is the sidechain. So we'll do the same thing. We'll listen on, then off, then back on. So here we go. So instant bounce for me, so that's awesome. Now, if you saw this guy right here, which is actually the punch, right? So the kick transient one, it's not actually doing anything because I have this LFO tool set to 100%. You can see, and it's actually just taking out the transient anyway. So I don't even need the transient in this case because the pump I have just set to 100%. So I hope you're getting the same vibe that I am, that maybe this is a little bit subtle, but I think it's a little bit beyond subtle. I think that it really makes an enormous difference in the vibe of the groove and how you actually physically respond to the music, which is key for a dance track. And next, for the final part of the demonstration, let's just walk through the first 3 steps. And then also, I want to show you, in case you don't have the LFO tool, how you can kind of achieve the same kind of sidechain effect. So I'm literally just going to go grab some loops, and we'll just start dropping them in here. All right, so we've got a couple loops here to work with just to go through the first 3 steps. And let's check this out. This is the kick right here. Let's see where it's sitting. So it's a little bit above -6, you know what? And I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. I said the magic window is really -6 to -4. It's within that range, so let's go ahead and leave it. If the kick was a little bit below -6, then I'd probably push it up to -6. But for now, this looks pretty good, so we'll leave it there. And then the bass, what's going on with the bass? Now, these are just samples just dragged in from loops, so most of the time they're going to be pretty close. And so just making sure the kick is there, making sure the bass is there, and then it's really about just getting the sidechain. So here's the bass. All right. right, so this actually looks pretty good, okay? It's starting to move up here closer to 100 hertz, and that's perfect. Now, I do want to actually point out, if the bass starts to get a little bit below 50 hertz, I know that I defined anything kind of below 100 hertz, but this is a good opportunity for me to give a little extra detail. If it starts to go below 50 hertz, then I like it to go below 12. Okay, because then it's really hard on the club systems to reproduce those low frequencies at that level, and it takes a lot of headroom up for those frequencies to even really translate well. And so we can see this guy right here is setting at 42 hertz, so that's below 50 hertz, and that's negative 15, so that's okay. And this guy right here is around 52 hertz, sitting around negative 12. Maybe we can give a little bit of a boost in this area right here, but this is looking really good right at negative 6, so we're looking maybe to do just a little bit of a boost around right around here, around 55 hertz would be an A. So just a tiny little one, nothing crazy, but just to show you. And let's just come over here to 55 hertz. We're going to boost the Q just a little bit, and I'm going to drop an analyzer onto the track so we can kind of monitor it at the same time. There we go. So now that's inside the window. You can see I just did a little bit of a boost here. And maybe we can tighten up the Q just a little bit, maybe around 4. So that's just getting that 55 hertz up a little bit more within that window. So there we go. That's all we needed to do there. Now it's all about getting the sidechain right, the 3-part sidechain. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a little rack that I created. Nothing crazy. It's just the LFO tool. I should probably make a rack for this entire thing, but it's just the Kick SC right here. It's just the LFO tool inside of an Ableton rack, and I'm going to go ahead and macro the LFO tool depth. And we're going to rename this punch, okay, because we're concerned with that kick transient coming through, so we want to kind of adjust how much punch we're going to let through. Now, this is just kind of the default that I've set up, but for the transient, what I want to do is get it more like this. Now, why is that? So let's go ahead and check out the kick in the LFO tool. This is the master LFO tool here. It's just monitoring the waveform, so let's take a look at what the kick looks like. Perfect. So this part right here is the transient. Now, as you know, a kick basically is a sine wave that kind of, well, most of the time it's a sine wave that just kind of pitches down quickly from a high frequency and then settles into a low frequency, which will be the fundamental or the pitch. And so you can see these little waveforms right here are bunched together because they're higher frequencies. They're playing at a higher frequency, and then we move to a lower frequency because there's a lower frequency of cycles down here. And so we're just moving down, but it's these higher frequencies that make the transient or the click or the punch of the kick. And we can see if I separate the kick kind of just using this node right here, this is really where the transient is, and then after that, that's where it really moves into the lower part of the kick. And so what I want to do is I want to make sure that this part of the kick, the transient, gets expressed every single time in the track. Now, when you have a kick and bass playing together, what you risk if you don't do the sidechaining is that the low frequencies or even some of the mid frequencies of the kick are just going to go away. So I'm going to play the kick and the bass together right now, and the bass does not have any sidechain enabled because I have the depth all the way down. The depth is pretty much just like the dry wet. It's not technically the dry wet, but we could think of it as the dry wet for the LFO tool. But let's check out the waveform here. This is the master LFO tool. Let's see what happens to the waveform when the kick and bass play together. See that inconsistency on every beat? That is just really bad, because then this is supposed to be the punch, the pulse of the beat, but there's like nothing there. We get a little bit of high frequency and then it just kind of drops out. Now, if I increase the punch on the LFO tool here, you'll see the depth is now 100%, which means that this volume envelope is being applied to the bass. So we're bringing the volume down, then we're bringing it back up quickly, and then the bass is at full volume, and then we just kind of drop it down quickly at the end. And so let's check this out now. And so now we have a very consistent punch every single time. So this kick is going to slam in the track every single time. And I want to give the kick as much bandwidth on the club speakers as possible, so that way it can really just have that impact. All right, so the next thing we could do is start pulling a little bit back on the depth here and let a little bit of the bass through. So we get a little bit of continuity in the bass, but then we still are making sure we're not interfering with the kick transient in a negative way. So let's just pull back on this depth a little bit. There we go, something like that. So we're letting a little bit of bleed happen so it feels a little bit more continuous, but we're still getting the impact from the kick. Perfect. So the next thing to do is to sidechain the body of the kick. So next, I'm just going to duplicate the LFO tool here, and I'm just going to draw a little bit more aggressive of an envelope here because this is now starting to define the low end groove or the pump of the bass. Now, if you remember, there was a technical consideration that I was talking about before, and before we dive into this second part of the sidechain trick, let's look at that technical consideration. So we've made room for the first part of the kick, but now we can see the back half of the kick right here, okay, the tail of the kick, that's adding up together with the bass to create this pretty big level spike. So if we jump over to the master limiter, we can see probably that they're adding up and engaging the master limiter here. Let's check it out. Okay, I mean, not too bad. It does get a little bit wonky. If we reset the meter here, we see it's attenuating by -4. Okay, that's maybe a little much. It's not the end of the world, but what we could do is now kind of start defining the groove and then taking care of that small technical problem. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back over to the bass, and we will move this over to macro 2, the depth to macro 2, and we're going to call this pump. Perfect. And then I'm just going to lift this guy up, and then what we could do is start moving this node around, or you can create however many nodes you want, but I typically just am lazy and just use one, and I just try to find a nice pump, and then I'll pull back on the depth a little bit. Now, obviously I'm going to pull back on the depth here because if I didn't, then it would completely defeat the purpose of the transient sidechain, because here we're pulling away from the transient as well. So definitely going to pull back on the pump, but for now I just want to get an exaggerated pump before we kind of tame it back. Cool. And so I kind of like that. That's obviously an exaggerated form, but you can see on the master LFO tool here, let's move this over here. It might make a little bit more sense because then the bass is moving into this next LFO tool. You can see that we're kind of taming that small technical problem. So if I turn this off, I turn the pump all the way off, you will see that this is the back half of the kick with the bass are kind of adding up in a big way. So big level spikes. When we bring the pump all the way up, we're taking care of that small problem. But the bass is kind of totally gutted. So let's start kind of pulling this back. All right, so let's start around 100 here. And then last up, we just need to get the sidechain compressor. So let's enable sidechain. And we'll select the audio input from the kick, which is this guy right here. I renamed it to kick 1. And infinite ratio, I'm going to turn auto on here on the release. We don't need to worry about the attack because we already have this LFO tool here taking away the transient. We also have the LFO tool here taming the transient a little bit more so we can be a little bit more relaxed on the attack time. And then the only thing we need to do is just bring down the threshold, and that's it. And so this is always very, very small amounts, usually around -3 to -4 here. But to me, this is the secret ingredient. It just locks and connects the kick and bass together. So if I turn it off, it's going to be very subtle. But just try to listen for a more organic feel to it. So here we go. Cool. Night and day for me. I know it's subtle, but if you do this a lot, if you go through this process a lot, you'll really pick up on those details. And this is that's definitely one of them, and I love that trick. Cool, we can make some fine adjustments here. I kind of want to let a little bit of the pump through a little bit more, so right around there, I'm liking those settings now. And so now if we look at the master limiter, we can see how much engagement we're getting. Reset the meter here, let's check it out. So half a dB. So we were at -4 attenuation, or 4 dBs of attenuation. Now we're at half a dB of attenuation. And we're also getting a nice pump effect between those two. And so we're sitting technically right, but we also have a nice creative and organic interaction between the kick and the bass. So before, here we go. And then when you add in the tops that are bouncing with the groove, and everything else is really just going to move. And of course, you could pull this back if you want to, and just get a little bit more to cut through, because this is one of those styles of bass where if you let the mid-range through a little bit more, that could be pretty cool. But for now, let's go ahead and move on to the next loop. I'm just going to jump over to this guy. I like him more. So let's check out where the kick is sitting. That's step number 1. Cool. All right, so we're a little bit below. So all we need to do is let's see where this kick is. All right, so it looks like it's about an A with the fundamental frequency, but what we want to do is get that peak up here, okay? So we'll go ahead and just boost a little bit here. We'll get the EQ, turn the filter off, 55 hertz, spectrum analyzer, increase the Q. Here we go. There we go. Just pushing that guy up there. That's it. And then the bass, let's check on the bass. Here we go. So these guys are a little bit quiet down here, as you can see. Now, right here, this guy's sitting at 41, so we want to keep him, again, below -12 here. So anything kind of below 50, I want to kind of start rolling off down there. But here we have one at 55, so that's at -12 or -13, so we could push him up at 55. Also, we have one at 87 around -11. Maybe we can give that guy a little bit of a boost as well. Now, there's a couple ways we can approach this. We can approach this with a shelf, boosting with a shelf, and then doing a filter roll-off, making sure that this guy stays below kind of -12. But another thing we could do is these are pretty specific frequencies, and so we can boost the 55 and we could boost the 87. A third option might be just to find some kind of center point here, so maybe like 65 to 70 hertz, and boost kind of in between there, bringing both of these up at the same time. But I'm going to go the more specific route. Let's do 55 and 87. And I'm going to grab the EQ and a spectrum analyzer. So I'm going to just highlight these together, and I'm going to increase the Q maybe to around 3. Then we can kind of just boost the gain of these together, and keeping an eye on the spectrum analyzer to see where they end up. Here we go. All right, cool. So this guy's getting a little high. Maybe we can bring him back down just a little bit. So let's drop him down a little. Maybe we can drop down to 55 hertz just a little bit as well. Cool. I mean, that looks pretty good. From it sounds good. I mean, you can barely tell the difference listening-wise, but according to the technical readouts, it seems pretty good. So let's listen to these guys together. All right, so the kick is in the right spot, the bass is in the right spot. The next thing that we have to do is get the low-end groove right. And so this time we're actually going to use the compressors. Just in case you don't have the LFO tool, this is how you can do something similar. It's only going to be a 2-stage process. We're going to be using 2 compressors, but they're going to be doing basically the exact same thing we have been doing. The first one's going to make room for the kick transient, but then the second one is going to both start defining the low-end groove and create the organic interaction between the kick and the bass. The first thing we need to do is set up this one, which is making room for the kick transient. Let's rename this to punch, and let's rename this one to pump. Awesome. And so what we need to do is enable sidechain. We'll get the kick, Now for this guy, what we need is we need a really short sound to trigger the compressor, because we need to have the release recover quickly so that when we come over to here, we can define the low end groove a little bit better over here. This one's really just moving the bass out of the way when the kick transient plays. And so the best way to do this is to enable the EQ or the filter on the sidechain input. And so what this does is it lets you EQ or filter the sidechain input in a way that lets you shape the sound the way you need it to trigger the kind of compression that you want. We want to shorten the sound, and so if we're working with the kick as a sidechain input, if I filter out the low end, what I'm effectively doing is just removing the tail of the kick. So we're just left with a shorter sound, because the higher frequencies are in the beginning of the kick and the kick transient, and then it just moves into the lower frequencies. But again, if I filter those lower frequencies out, they're gone and we're left with a short sound, which is exactly what we want. So let me just show you that. If I turn on the listen feature here in the sidechain, this is going to preview the sidechain input. So if I solo the bass channel here, we're not going to be hearing the bass, we're actually just going to be hearing the sidechain input. And we're also only listening to 200 hertz and above. Now I turn this EQ off, we're going to hear the full kick. Again, even though the bass channel is soloed, okay, there's the full kick. We turn the EQ on, it's filtering out everything below 200. And we can make it even tighter by increasing the filter here. So right around there. So that's exactly what we need to do. We just need to get a nice tight sound to trigger the compression to make room for the kick transient. Now let's get the infinite ratio. We need an immediate attack because, again, we're just trying to make room for this very beginning part of the kick. So we need the sidechain compression to activate immediately. And then the last thing we need to do is just get the release time right. Now we don't necessarily want to have an immediate release time because that's going to cause compression distortion. Let me show you what that sounds like. Check this out. Hear that crunch? That's compression distortion. When you have attack and release very fast, the compressor almost kind of like folds over on itself and it causes it to distort. But as soon as we increase the release time, that's going to go away. Check this out. All right, and then another thing about the release time here that's cool is that Ableton gives us two different types of release characteristics, or two different types of release envelopes. One of them is logarithmic, the other one is linear. So you can click on this, and that's kind of cool, but we still don't get as much control or precise control as we do in the LFO tool. With the LFO tool, we can literally draw in exactly the release characteristics or release envelope that we want. So with this one, it's obviously a linear release envelope. It's just going right back up to the top, okay? And then this one is a little bit more logarithmic, I think you could say. Like maybe that would be a little bit more logarithmic, although it's still kind of, I guess we would have to do something like this to make it a little bit smoother. That would be more logarithmic. But the thing about the LFO tool is that we have very precise control over the exact type of release envelope that we want to draw in. With the compressor, we're limited to really just these two. We have the release time, and then we have the release envelope with the two different options there. But that's okay. Let's go ahead and crank the threshold and see what difference the logarithmic versus linear envelope does. It's kind of hard to tell the difference between the logarithmic and a linear. Let's go ahead and increase the release a little bit. That'll probably help out a little bit. You can see the two different shapes, how the logarithmic kind of slopes up a little bit quicker and then kind of slowly fades back into zero gain reduction, where the linear kind of just goes straight back to zero gain reduction. Check this out. So cool. And so the logarithmic to me is a little bit smoother, and it's going to work for this purpose because it just acts quicker. And so that's what I'm looking for here. Let's go ahead and dial the release time back to around 20 milliseconds. Okay, right around there. That's cool. And then what we need to do finally is get this guy going. Sidechain again is enabled with kick 2. We don't need the EQ on, infinite ratio. We could be a little bit more relaxed with the attack because we're already making room for the kick transient with this guy. And then the key here for me is having the auto release on, because then the compressor is going to decide what release time to have based on the information that it receives from the kick. And so that's where they really interact in a real way. The compressor's kind of making a decision based on what it's receiving instead of me just setting a fixed release time like I did over here. But let's just go ahead and same thing. We could just be kind of casual about this. Just drop this down. It's not going to be very much, maybe a little bit more than before, because we have to kind of also really define the low end pump here. But let's go ahead and pull this down. Let's actually get the kick in here as well. All right, that sounds pretty good. And so let's just come over to the L2 here. So this is the master limiter. So if we turn these compressors off, let's see what kind of engagement we're getting. So we're getting about 7 dBs of gain reduction here. And so if I turn on the compressors, let's reset the meter. Okay, we brought it down to about 2 dB, and I don't think we're affecting the sound negatively at all. So here we go. Let's listen on, off, and then on again. Cool, and so that's doing exactly what it needs to be doing. It's making room for the kick transient, so the kick is better expressed every single time on the beat, and it's also getting that pump, and it's also serving the technical purpose of not over-engaging the limiter, so it's doing everything that it needs to do. And then the check-in with the LFO tool, just to double-check the kick transient here, making sure it's expressed clearly, and we'll probably see a little bit of movement, though. Let's check this out. That looks really good. I mean, the kick is just clearly expressed every single time. If I turn off the side chains here, check this out. Not good, okay? That equals 0 punch in the club. It's not going to translate well. But when we turn these guys on, it will. All right, and so that is how you do it with just 2 compressors. Pretty simple. Again, not the same level of precise control that you get with the LFO tools, but effective nonetheless. Awesome. So those are the first 3 steps: getting that kick to -6, getting the bass harmonics under 100 hertz between -6 and -12. And we did go into a little bit more detail. When we have frequencies below 50 hertz, you want to kind of start slowly rolling those off below -12, because it's going to be really hard for the hard on the club system to reproduce those low frequencies. And step 3 is that 3-part sidechain trick. You got to make room for that kick transient because you want that consistent punch. And I showed you a visual representation of that in the waveform display of the LFO tool. And then you wanted to find the low end groove. That's where it really comes together, is when you start getting that pump between the kick and the bass. And then what I like to do, and I think this is the magic step, this is the magic step for me, is create an organic interaction between the kick and the bass using sidechain compression, so you impart the actual kick dynamics onto the bass, even if it's just in a subtle amount. You get those 2 elements interacting in a real way. So I hope that was helpful. Again, I hope that you have questions. That's the point of this. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to your questions.